So I'll go to my grave knowing that there was something in that lake. It's just a question of, will the rest of the world believe it or not?
Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be fucked up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occultae Veritatis. Hello, and welcome to Occultae Veritatis podcast. I'm Ood Gallifrey, and in studio with me, I have
Sage Berry,
Richard Bigley,
Leon Felger,
the soundboard demon,
and the person that's going to be lead presenting this episode,
Rob Grosse.
Yeah, we're going to be covering the Turtle Lake Monster today, but before we dive into that, let's dive into some poison.
So, what's your poison?
What's your poison?
So, this is called sea salt pina colada.
Oh, it sounds good.
Somebody got me one of these, vaporizer thingies for my birthday, and I can see why people like them. It gets me just right off my ass. And it actually does taste pina colada-y.
It's certainly very sweet.
Yeah, I'm surprised how convenient those little things are, because usually I'd have to, grind up a bowl and light it up, and then deal with the bowl afterward. Now, I know those don't have a lot of medical tests on them, so I could be ruining my lungs in just a new, brilliant way, but...
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Same.
It can't possibly be any worse than just straight smoking flour, right?
Probably not. I hope not, because I'm just putting tar straight into my lungs when I smoke just flour, so I think that's better, but maybe there's some, fucky shit that goes on with the oil when it's, superheated and aerolized and all that.
Huh.
Well, Leon took the biggest hoot out of all of us. How does it feel?
It's becoming an ordeal.
I guess it's good that we have some space between you need to present your episode.
Yeah, because I could not present my episode right now.
Becoming an ordeal out of 10.
Oh, fuck.
I didn't mind the flavor. I'll give it a 6 out of 10.
It was good. It tasted good, and I feel woo.
Yeah, it tastes better than I thought. When I heard flavored, I thought it was going to be chocolate-flavored condoms taste like shit, but that actually tastes like a pina colada.
It does. It's good.
So, I don't know if you've been using the chocolate-flavored condoms or just used condoms if they taste like shit.
Well, I do both. Use chocolate condoms. I hope there's a collective gag around the world from that. Yeah.
Episode.
Yeah. Now that I've done my blue comedy, let's dive into some local lake monster lore.
Yes.
Guys, we have to stop joking that there's nothing in Saskatchewan. Apparently there's at least one lake monster there. Turtle Lake Monster lives in Turtle Lake in central West Saskatchewan.
You're gonna fuck up my line there.
Yeah, right.
Look at it. It's you. We'll get it in the boat.
Okay, just wait. Just poke him down a bit.
Oh my God.
This is happening, Chubb? Come on, buddy.
Get him.
That's it.
There were lots of people coming in and saying they had seen this thing out in the lake and they didn't know what it was, but it was really scary and had humps on it. And one man came in and said, well, it looked like a big long log, and then it started moving.
It's rumored to have ripped fishing nets, caused cracks in the lake's winter ice, and there are even those who suggest that the creature is responsible for unexplained drownings.
The monster is anywhere from 10 to 30 feet long, has a smooth or scaly appearance, and has a head that looks like it's a combination of a dog, seahorse, and a pig. It also doesn't have a dorsal fin. Reports of the monster date back to the Cree, who blamed it for disappearances in the area.
Turtle Lake Monster is real, for sure. It is.
Well, I just know that there's a lot of sightings, but one couple had told me one day they were boating along, and then all of a sudden they hit something
that their boat just made a thud.
I think he's friendly, and I don't think he's going to hurt anybody. I think just leave him alone and let him do his thing.
This is Robert Grosse from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. I am a father of 4. I work in IT. I'm a university graduate. And as a child, my brother and I managed to see the Turtle Lake Monster in Turtle Lake, Saskatchewan. And I'm going to tell you the story of that occasion.
What got you interested in Turtle Lake and its monster?
Well, good question there. When we were young, our family happened to have a cabin up at Turtle Lake during my sort of what I would refer to as my formative years. Everything around you just impacts you so deeply when you're young because you don't have a lot of life history. I always refer to my Turtle Lake years as kind of the magical childhood years that we all kind of lust for.
Like skipping in the fields with butterflies and all
exactly,
that?
Kind of stuff. Yeah, I saw my first fireball up there, and I remember, I remember even sticking my fingers in my ears because I was afraid there's going to be this big boom. And there was like absolute silence. But it was just this magical, it's all forests, it's water, it's motorcycles, it's your first taste of freedom. Your parents give you that little tiny bit of freedom. They basically say, you're 11 years old. You can take the canoe out now with a little motor by yourself. You've got these first little essences of freedom and discovery. It's all about discovering the world. So yeah, those young years between about 78 and 87 were, to me, probably some of the most magical years I ever had as a kid.
For listeners out there who aren't familiar with Turtle Lake and the city surrounding it,
yeah, and in fact, I got to correct you because it's actually not a town. It's a lake. There's multiple little villages and hamlets that are sort of around that area, and Livelong would be the nearest kind of village. But it's mostly just lake communities. Like a lot of them have incorporated as like hamlets and stuff like that. So so it's primarily a resort community or resort communities, I should say. So because it's a big lake, it's about 27 kilometers long. It's about 5 kilometers wide at its widest, and then it just has all these little nested communities all around it, kind of thing. So
that's cool.
Yeah. So, and back in the 70s, it was still what I would kind of refer to as frontierish because I remember like bulldozers. I remember like lines of trees. They were still felling trees to put roads in, stuff like that. So being a city kid coming from, a reasonable sized city, you got to put yourself in that kind of mindset of young children just exploring the world. It just so happened in that sort of nine-ish year period that we had a cabin up there. We happened to have an experience with the notorious Turtle Lake Monster that I'll tell you all about. It kind of stuck with me for a number of years, but it wasn't something, we were kids. It wasn't something you're going to I wasn't going to go out and share it with newspapers. We were kids, right? So we had this experience, that kind of thing. It was awesome, but it wasn't until later on in life that I just decided, you know what? I'm not getting any younger. This is one of maybe the more unique things I can share with the world, leave a little bit of a legacy. This is maybe something that's kind of cool that I want to make sure I share before I'm like 3 feet under,
Oh, hell yeah.
That kind of thing. So I just thought, it's now or never. I should, why didn't I share this earlier? I don't know.
That's a really shallow fucking grave, 3 feet. Like people are still gonna smell you through the grass.
Yeah, I suppose, eh?
Well, it sounds like you're planning on getting murdered instead of conventional burial.
Right, yeah. So basically, it was just in the last few years, I started getting into ancestry as a hobby first back in maybe 2015, 2016. I have a biology degree and I have a history degree. So it's kind of a natural thing for me to kind of start diving into my family history and genetics and all that kind of cool stuff. And I think that's where I really started getting my taste of history. And I started reading a lot about my ancestors and the stuff that was left behind about them. And then I started thinking, well, what am I going to leave behind? Like what kind of, I haven't left anything. I haven't written a story. I haven't done anything. So, what am I going to leave behind for my kids and their kids and that sort of thing. So I started looking at this, the Turtle Lake Monster legend. And indeed, if you go hunting for it online, you will find little tidbits here and there. There's a Wikipedia page, there's stuff like that. But it's very few and far between. There's a couple of like mystery books that were written here in Canada, a paragraph blurb. So it's like maybe a 250-page book, but there's like half a paragraph about the Turtle Lake Monster. It's there, but this isn't well known. Like, and the closer you get to Turtle Lake, the better known it is, that kind of thing. And I would just estimate that just in our province alone, probably only half the population has heard of it, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so after I started writing down my experience, I started thinking, well, who's like collecting all the stories? Who's researching this? Who's kind of pooling it all together into a spot, because otherwise it's going to get lost.
Yeah.
And so my second interest after telling my story was really just starting to collect other people's stories, because I was far from the only person that saw this. This is not a unique one-person experience. Many, many people saw it. And there were countless newspaper articles written about it, primarily in the 70s and 80s. There was sort of a big period of writing.
Like Betsy saw this monster at the side of the lake while she was doing her laundry and stuff like that.
That sort of thing, because you got to remember that back in the 70s and 80s, people didn't have cell phones in their pockets. It's easy for especially young people now to realize, like, well, why don't you have a picture? Why don't you have something to show us that's substantial? It's because nobody had a camera in your pocket. Yeah. If you wanted to take a picture of something, you took a camera with you. And how often did you actually, for practical purposes, carry a full-size camera with you? Very rarely.
And that was before digital cameras. Like back in the 70s and 80s, you could get a camera you could like bash a dude over the head with pretty easily.
You'd have to pay for developing and everything else afterwards.
Well, and that was the painful part, because I did have a film-based camera, and I remember those days of taking pictures, and you just hope they turn out, and you don't know until you get them developed whether your photos even turned out. It's so nice not to have to worry about that in this digital age now. But anyway, I was just going to start for your listeners to just mention kind of where Turtle Lake is and that kind of thing, because the province of Saskatchewan is kind of weird in that most people just think of it as prairies and wheat and that kind of stuff, and really half our province is trees and forest. Yeah. And a lot of it is not even accessible by road up there as you get farther and farther north. We have like 100,000 lakes. I had to joke because I remember, I think it was Minnesota that had a license plate that said land of 10,000 lakes.
Oh, small fry.
Small fry. That's just trivial. We have 100,000, baby.
Oh, okay.
So I was wondering, like, why did we ever promote that on our license plates? I don't know. But anyways, so we have a lot of lakes up there. Now, Turtle Lake is not that far north. It's kind of in the mid section of the province, but it is getting into that tree line and that frontier land that I was kind of talking about, which made it a pretty magical place. And yet it was only about 250 kilometers from Saskatoon, where we are now. That brings up another point. I should probably talk in hours, because this is a little known point. I don't know if you guys know about this, but a lot of people in Canada that live in more rural areas, we talk in kilometers, but a lot of people from bigger center talk in hours, because kilometers is irrelevant. It's absolutely... So I'll flip it around and I'll say about 2.5 hours from Saskatoon as a drive, and about an hour north of North Battleford, and it's not that far from the Alberta border, about 80 to 100 kilometers from Lloydminster, just to give people an idea of where the lake is. So First Nations oral tradition is most likely where this legend had its basis, although I don't have dates that go along with that. But I want to give the First Nations people full credit in that this most likely started in their world. So when I say that the legend of the Turtle Lake Monster is 100 years old, which it is, when you look at written sources, it may in fact be older than that. A lot
of indigenous keep oral tradition, so it's hard to have records of that.
Oh, huge. And so I wanted to start there, and so we have written reports of something unusual in the lake going back into 1923, which makes this legend exactly 100 years old. That's another reason why I wanted to bring this up, is because the legend turns 100, at least 100, and that's something to celebrate. But what are we celebrating? Because most people don't know about it. So let's get the message out there that, hey, British Columbia has Ogopogo. Well, we have a cool monster too that most people haven't heard about, and there's a rich legacy and legend of articles about this monster, again, that nobody knows about it, and that's why I took it on me, because I just didn't see anybody else doing it. I thought, well, maybe this could be a little niche I could develop for myself, and I can just be one of the advocates of our monster, our provincial monster, that kind of thing. So that's how it all started, and maybe I can just jump a little bit into what the First Nations people thought. I'm only going on the research I've been able to collect so far, so this may or may not be accurate. I don't know, but they refer to it as big fish, as big fish, not necessarily magical and not necessarily supernatural either. The Cree were the first to speak of telling cautionary tales about people who had vanished after venturing into the monster's territory. That's probably one of the scariest images of the monster that I've found, because for the most part, most of the experiences I've been able to collect are not particularly scary. I'd known about the monster for a long time when I was a kid. It never stopped us from swimming in that lake. We swam in the lake all the time. So this isn't necessarily a terrifying story. It's a cool story. That's the way I kind of see it.
just because you did mention that the Cree would call it big fish.
Yeah.
This is a common thing that happens in Cree. I did find on an online Cree dictionary that mistamek is a northern word for big fish, which can also mean a large salmon or a whale. There's a Plains Cree word version as well, but it's much longer and harder to pronounce. Just an odd fact, the word for dog in Cree is atim, and the word for horse is misatim, which literally means big dog.
Very interesting. And I think it's interesting you mentioned dog because I think it's been referenced. Some people thought it had a head like a dog. This is probably a good place to mention that one of the leading theories of what's in the lake is potentially a group of between 1 and 3 river sturgeon.
About 1 hour in. 1 hour, 7 jumps.
Along the Upper Fraser River in Lillooet, Steve Eklund and Mark Boyce struggled to hang on to their catch. It's their first time sturgeon fishing.
Gone downstream maybe a kilometer with him, and he's just fighting us hard.
On their line is a sturgeon estimated to be 10 feet long and weigh 700 pounds.
And Mark and I were like, oh, here we go.
Several times it breaches the water.
And when that fish jumped out of the water, the sheer size and magnitude, finally hit us. It looked like the movie Jaws, in slow motion when Jaws comes out of the water. Incredible.
2 hours later, success. The visitors from Alberta are exhausted.
Now, Turtle Lake drains into the North Saskatchewan River through the Turtle Lake River. It's more of a creek. Like if you look at it now, I couldn't believe they called it a river because it's nowadays it's a creek, and it's only going to have substantial outflow during times where there's a lot of water that's collected in the lake. So nowadays you look at it and you think, man, how could lake sturgeon possibly come up that river? But in times past, there are times of greater and less drainage. So it's very, very practical and plausible to think that maybe these are just river sturgeon that happen to get stuck in the lake, and they would have come up the Turtle River during times of high outflow because it is well-known fact that there are river sturgeon in the North Saskatchewan River. So this makes a very, very plausible theory, and indeed it kind of aligns with a lot of things. What Dave and I saw, my brother Dave was with me when we saw it. But B, also it's the time period. Sturgeon can live up to and indeed possibly even over 100 years.
And sturgeon are the reason that Saskatchewan actually has a fairly booming caviar sector, because our North Saskatchewan River sturgeon piss out those little eggs that are actually caviar.
I didn't even know that. That's cool.
Yeah, it's sturgeon eggs.
Yeah, cool. So that's one of the plausible theories. But there's a couple of things that complicate that theory because our Saskatchewan Fisheries Department has conducted extensive research on not only Turtle Lake, but a lot of our lakes to determine health of our fisheries, that kind of thing. And there was a large, very detailed report that was done in 1967. Now, there might be newer ones. That just happened to be the one that I happened to be able to collect and read. There's no talk of sturgeon in the lake. Nobody has ever netted like that. The Turtle Lake was commercially fished back in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
There's never been a record of a sturgeon being pulled out of that lake.
And you usually catch like one on a line or one on a net with the other fish.
And in fact, I've heard rumors, I haven't seen documentation that says this, but I heard a rumor that a sturgeon has been yanked out of Candle Lake, for example, but that it was already known that there were sturgeon in that lake. There has never been a sturgeon pulled out of Turtle Lake, which makes it kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It just adds to the mystery because everybody loves a mystery, right?
There's been test netting with gill nets and trap nets in 1955, 73, 76, 79, 82, 85, 92, 97, 2000, and 2003. And they have found 10 species of fish, none of which are sturgeon.
Interesting. And sturgeon aren't, they're not subtle fish. Like,
no.
Look at how big that fucking thing is.
Yeah. Like their face is very flat and gaunt. Like I can see somebody like seeing that just at the bottom, like underneath a big water, it probably looks weird as fuck. It looks almost like it's looking up at you when it's kind of just like the shape of its skull.
Right.
And it's a super ancient fish too, right? Like those fucking things have been around for like hundreds of millions of years.
Yeah.
Like they were kicking around with the dinosaurs and they managed to escape. But like you're looking at a dinosaur right now.
Yeah, a genetic anomaly. It's one of those interesting things that really, for whatever reason, was not pushed to develop or change. So they, I guess you could say they were probably perfectly adapted to particular niches. So another interesting thing, and we were talking about this a little earlier pre-show, was about like Loch Ness and that kind of thing. Turtle Lake is a highly productive lake. So if you look at some of these reports, it's very, very, like flora fauna wise, it's a very productive lake. It's in the top 10 list in Saskatchewan as far as its productivity for fish, and that's indeed why in the early 1900s it was commercially fished. It was really a very vibrant, successful lake.
And just as a reminder, that's top 10 out of 100,000 lakes. Like, holy fuck.
Yeah, no kidding.
Like, this thing is bumping with bioactivity.
Yeah, totally. So that in my mind made it kind of plausible that this may be sturgeon. Now you might ask, well, where did this 1 to 3 come from? Well, from what I've heard, there was a story of someone who took some aerial photos from a plane and saw at least 2 shadows in the water that they couldn't make out, and they actually came down and confirmed that there was nothing, like it wasn't like canoes or something like that on the lake.
Yeah.
So shadows, that kind of thing made it kind of interesting to think that maybe there's more than one. It changes by day. Tomorrow somebody could present me with a new article that completely changes everything, right? But so what I'm going to say is, based on my current research, I haven't seen or heard of recent sightings in the last 20 years or so. They've kind of subsided. And then in my mind, that kind of thought, well, if it is a sturgeon and it does live to be around 100 years old, that almost kind of fits a timeline appropriately, that maybe it kicked the bucket.
Yeah, 1923 to
2023, that kind of thing. So it again kind of points towards the sturgeon theory as being a good one. But, and here's the wild thing is, a lot of people who've seen it will refer to it as a fish or fish-like. It's dark, potentially scaly, potentially a couple of little like dorsal fins, that kind of thing. Smooth, slimy, kind of slippery. Now, the interesting thing about sturgeon is that we all assume that all sturgeon are the same. There's multiple different types of sturgeon as well. So if you start Googling it, you'll see different species and subspecies of sturgeon. So, and again, that's assuming it even is a sturgeon, because nobody has pulled anything out of the lake to say yes or no. And that's why we still today consider it a cryptid, or basically a cryptid is just a creature that's as of yet unidentified by science. So, and I'm very comfortable with that because it just keeps possibilities open. In fact, on that note, did you know there was actually a mammal that was found in northern Vietnam in the 90s that was never known to science, and it was discovered in 1992. Actually, I have the name of it. I'll probably find it a little bit later. That I can.
Is that it?
Yeah, I think it's Asian unicorn. That's the one. Yeah, you found it. So there are still that kind of gave me hope that, just we think we have it all figured out, right? We think we have the world cased, and, who are these crackpots saying there's something weird in various lakes and stuff like that? How do we know that we have all of this cased, right? Really, I like to keep an open mind. I'm scientifically minded. I have a degree in biology. I don't just, I do take these things as legends and stories, but I keep a very open mind. I mean, I've seen it, and I have to keep an open mind in this instance, because I did see it with my own eyes, and it, honest to goodness, was as real as you and I just sitting around here talking right now. This was very, very real. So I'll go to my grave knowing that there was something in that lake. I know. It's just a question of, will the rest of the world believe it or not, right, is the big thing. But at least I wasn't the only one, based on newspaper articles. When Dave and I should get into the whole experience, but when Dave and I saw it from a distance, it just looked like a floating pole. It just looked like somebody had cut a power pole in half, or a telephone pole, and that it was just floating out in the middle of the lake.
Weird.
So maybe it's a good time for me to get into my little story here. So I'll take you back to August of 1985. And because that's when this happened. And the reason I know it was August of 85 is because somebody, my birthday in October of 85, somebody gave me a diary for a present, for a birthday present. And the first thing I wrote about was the Turtle Lake Monster that had happened just a couple of months earlier.
Oh, shit.
So it's kind of cool that what I have in my hand is actually not an account from 40-something-year-old Rob. I have an account from 12-year-old Rob. So I was going to read for you what 12-year-old Rob wrote.
Yeah.
So this is in my old 12-year-old diction, right? So
Yeah.
so
That's
please,
awesome.
please bear with me and just think back. It's a kid writing this about his memory of what the monster story was. So so here I go. I'm going to start. In August, me and Dave decided to go out on a boat ride on a very beautiful evening. While we were out on our ride in Turtle Lake, the area of Copp's Cove, David first noticed what appeared to be a log of some sort lying out in the water. A moment later, the supposed log went underwater and then reappeared. We then found out it was probably the Turtle Lake Monster. David began to panic as we watched the dullish gray scaly fish swim for a few minutes or so. We were alone, and that is what it was. It was fantastic. Then David wanted to go home, and I thought it wasn't a bad idea. So I started the 4-horsepower Johnson engine on our canoe and opened the throttle to head home. We went screaming up to the cabin with excitement, telling everyone. Dad told us to try and get a picture of it, but when we arrived back, it was gone.
Yeah. Ain't that always the tale? Eh?
Where is Copp's Cove on the map there?
Oh, okay. On the map. So if it's going to be towards the south of the lake, and you see where that black line is. So if you go, you're going to see, you're going to pull out and you're going to go to the other side of the lake, to the west side.
That's what I do when I pull out.
Go to the other side of the lake.
I was waiting for that. As soon as I said that.
You were like, oh no, I've opened a door.
I just walked into that one.
Okay, Leon's on duty.
Kopps Cove.
Yeah, so there you go. Copp's Cove is right there. So it's towards the southern part of the lake. And it is August, and I've heard that the monster tended to get a little bit more active and more sightings when the weather's warmer. So maybe it's just because cold-blooded, that kind of thing. They get more active, and the temperature is nice.
Just like other fish, right?
Yeah, totally. So it was right along there, and in fact, if you take a look, I don't know if you can see it on their Coon Avenue. Right at the bottom of Coon Avenue is where we happen to be. Dad gave us free rein with a canoe and motor, but we kind of stuck fairly close to our area of the lake. We went as far as the Northlander Inn, which is the extreme south of the lake, but that's really as far as we went with our little canoe. Anyway, that gives you an idea. So there's almost like a white dot on your screen there. It's pretty close to that little white dot is where we would have seen it.
Kind of in the center of the cove.
Dave and I, we just happened to be out for a ride that day. It was just the lake was exceptionally calm that evening. And what else are 12-year-old kids going to do? We have motorcycles, and we have a boat with a motor. My parents basically didn't see us. Like, we were gone. The second we got up to the lake, we were gone. So, of course, we were out doing stuff, and the lake was calm, and Mom was making supper. It was in the evening, and we were just like, well, let's go for a canoe ride. So, and that's when Dave spotted this, what looked to me, I swear up and down, it looked like half a power pole or a telephone pole. It really did. That's what we thought it was. And indeed, we had a rope, and we thought, hey, some boat's going to hit that. It was our first thought. Somebody's going to come along at 30 miles an hour and just cream that sucker.
Oh, yeah.
So our first thought was, hey, we have a rope, we have a motor. Let's just go and wrap a rope around it, and we're just going to pull it out of harm's way.
It must have been sitting pretty motionless for you to go through that whole thought process.
It was. We were probably a couple hundred feet away at that time. So we just interpreted it to be a bobbing log, bobbing up and down a little bit, that kind of thing. So, and because it wasn't moving a lot, that was the thing. And it wasn't until we got closer that we realized that that's not what it was. And of course, we had already heard the legend of the Turtle Lake Monster. It was well known by a lot of people up there, and we knew instantly what it was. And I guess one of my biggest regrets is that as kids, we didn't stay longer to watch it.
Yeah,
we were more interested in telling everybody. We were just like, oh, we saw it. We saw it. So we powered up the engine, and we thunder back to shore as fast as that little 4-horse Johnson would take us.
Yeah.
And we wanted to get up and tell everybody and tell our parents, and hey, you got to come down. Here it is.
Yeah, we saw this legendary thing.
Yeah. And that's basically the story. Of course, by the time we dragged Mom and Dad down, who were making supper, there was nothing there to see.
When it started moving, did it do the surprise thing where like all of a sudden it just like started moving and dived around, or did it just like more subtly like go under?
I think it was more subtle. And in fact, I was piloting the boat. Dave was up at the front. He remembers seeing a dorsal fin. I don't. Neither one of us saw a head. So really, that's what we saw was just the back of a large fish. I would estimate 7 to 10 feet long.
Holy shit!
Yeah, 7-10 feet is probably a pretty good estimate. Could have been longer. You know, this is 11-year-old kid scale. So yeah.
There were probably pike in that lake.
Oh goodness, yeah.
And would pike be the biggest like confirmed fish in that lake?
Pike, pickerel, or a walleye, I guess people call it.
Yeah.
And whitefish. I think whitefish was actually what was being commercially fished.
They would stock the lake with whitefish.
Yeah. So that was what was being commercially fished. At least I think it was commercially fished up until the 50s, and then they quit. And they, for a while, they were trying to throw back all the pickerel and pike because that was a game fish. They didn't want to destroy recreational fishing and that kind of thing. So
yeah.
So interestingly enough, that lake is also known to have some big fish in it. Because I've come across some interesting stories of a diver that was actually, this is maybe one of the little more morbid stories. There was a diver looking for a body. I don't have a year even attached to it, but there was a diver that was down in the lake looking for a body, and basically said that there were jack in that lake that were so big he wouldn't go down again.
Wow.
You know, that's crazy. And I'd heard that story. The funny thing is, I read it, but I'd heard that story as a kid as well. So it was kind of neat to see a few things substantiated, some rumors. You know, my dad used to say the same thing. He had a pair of polarized sunglasses, and he used to say that he used to, you know, go out in the boat and just sit and peer down with polarized glasses because you can see, you know, relatively deep. It was a relatively clear lake.
Yeah.
And he said you could see some large fish. He says when you'd be if you drop like a weighted hook down, he said you could literally see. My dad used to say this. You could see jack just saunter right by. It was almost like they had wised up to the hook, and they were like, no, I'm not going for that. These big old fish got big and old because they were too smart to go after a hook.
It's funny you say that. Like my uncle used to spearfish, and he told me he quit for almost the exact same reason. Like he didn't spearfish in Turtle Lake. He spearfished in Macwa Lake and Loon Lake. And he said he saw fish down there that made him feel like threatened, like this thing could hurt and or eat me, like kind of thing.
Wow.
And like I imagine there's some just old ancient jackfish just growing and eating.
Yeah.
Man.
And that's one thing I haven't researched. I don't know how long jackfish can live, like what kind of age. But I do know they can get rather large. You know?
Yeah. But not sturgeon, like
no,
like a record-breaking jackfish, like something you're going to win a tournament with is like 30, 40, 50 pounds.
Exactly.
Sturgeons are hundreds of pounds.
Yeah,
Google says the northern pike, or the jackfish, I guess, has a 7 to 10 year lifespan in captivity.
In captivity.
Oh, in captivity. I don't know if that actually extends their life or reduces it.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I guess bottom line, like, pike wouldn't get big enough to be confused for, like, half a telephone pole.
No, for sure.
The world's biggest sturgeon, the largest one on record, is 7.2 meters long and weighs 1,571 kilos, which is 3,400 pounds.
God damn.
According to superiorcountry.ca, a northern pike held in captivity usually live an average lifespan of 7 to 10 years, while their natural wild habitat live 15 to 25 years.
Oh, there you go.
And then there's a nice picture of a smiling fisherman holding a large northern pike.
Oh, there you go.
Now we'll talk briefly about some of the newspaper articles because, you know, it was one thing for Dave and I to have this cool experience and that kind of thing, and we carried this with us for years. But as I started to get nostalgic about all of this and start actually writing and researching it and that kind of thing, it was logical for me to start digging into newspaper archives.
Mm-hmm.
The earliest article I found so far is from May 5th, 1947.
Oh.
Saskatoon Star Phoenix.
Oh, here you go.
So 47, just after the war, which is kind of interesting. And I'll just read this little blurb because it's kind of cool. It's not very long.
Yeah.
It's an article titled "Open Season for Monsters." It says, "Meanwhile, we're waiting for news from Turtle Lake near Livelong, Saskatchewan, where Saskatchewan's native monster was once reported. Livelong is in the northeast. First details of its monster came from a fisherman who reported a long black creature of considerable length that frolicked on the water's surface far from shore. Whether or not our prairie monster survived the winter has not as of yet been ascertained." So,
I like that it frolicked.
Frolicked, yeah. I know, right? Well, it's interesting that this mentions that the story of a fisherman reported something frolicking from shore. Based on my research, what I've read so far is that the earliest account, and this comes from a book that John Kirk wrote in the 1990s called In the Domain of the Lake Monsters, The Search for the Denizens of the Deep. This is where I got the 1923 date from, actually, that we were talking about earlier. John writes here, it so happened at the very same year, 1923, it was recorded that a horse-headed animal with a long neck was seen by local resident Jack Matthews.
A horse-headed animal?
Yeah, interesting. So maybe that's what the Star Phoenix article is talking about. I don't know. But additionally, one of the earlier accounts, also in 1923, it was written, amidst winter ice, commercial fishermen complained that something huge was creating significant holes in their nets. So that's actually, this came from page 346 of a book called Live Long the Sands of Time. Back in the early 80s, this was very common for communities in Saskatchewan. I think there was a government grant that went around that encouraged communities to sort of document and write their history.
Yeah.
And so this was Live Long's book. I think that they wrote, I know a lot of different communities in Saskatchewan did those books in the early 80s, and this one came out of Live Long. And that's what they wrote. Sort of those are the two earliest accounts that I've been able to come up with. It's basically, this started with fishermen noticing that their nets were getting broken all the time, which was kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then there's this big gap between 1947 and the next article that I've been able to find so far is in 1979.
Okay.
So, and this is kind of where things start to peak. 79 to sort of late 80s is when the bulk of the articles that I've found anyways have been written about the topic. And yeah, there was one, January 10th, 1979, also in the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, Turtle Lake Monster is a popular topic. It says here, in winter, they say the beast lets fishermen know he's around by tearing huge holes in their nets. In the summer, it breaks surface to frighten onlookers with its enormous size, that kind of thing. It says here, 2 girls saw it last year while water skiing and were scared. They couldn't go back in. The North Battleford News Optimist carried a story of several corroborating reports that a primitive shark-like creature has been observed and discussed since early settlement in the area.
I mean, primitive shark-like, that kind of sounds like a sturgeon.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. And this article says, kind of interestingly, and remember I was mentioning that pilot story? Well, here it is. It says, one day a local pilot who was flying over the lake noticed that at first glance appeared to be 2 canoes speeding along the east shore. Failing to see any people in the black shapes, he instinctively banked and eased the plane down for a closer look. He reports that 2 aquatic creatures dived in unison as the craft maneuvered within 100 feet. The pilot said they were over 10 feet long, and he didn't see all of them because of their wake. It says fisheries biologists maintain that there is no documented evidence of lake sturgeon in Turtle Lake. One fisherman who reported glimpsing the beast 8 years ago said it was black. I would kind of agree. What Dave and I saw was dark. I mean, that's like, to me, it looked like an oil-coated. That's why I referred to it as a telephone or a power pole type thing. Kind of oil-coated, that kind of dark wood.
Yeah.
It was that dark kind of a color. That was the best way I could describe it. So
and that's against like the water too. So like it was probably a fair bit to appear dark against that water.
Yeah.
And who knows how many guys like you were out there that like saw something as a kid or saw something as an adult and just like never thought like it was a big enough deal to write about or go to the media about. It's just kind of a little family story, you know?
Oh, totally. In fact, it's funny you say that because I was up there last year or the year before with my kids, just kind of retracing family roots, showing them, hey, this is the old cabin and this is where I grew up and blah, 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 blah. And we went into the old store at the Northlander Inn, which is still there. And there was an older lady working in there. And you know, I just kind of mentioned to her what I was up there doing, and I was going to be interviewed by a TV show here this afternoon, and blah blah blah. And this is what I'm Turtle Lake Monster, yada yada yada. And she said, "Oh yeah, I saw that. I saw the monster." And I just said, "Oh really?" I said, "Well, this TV crew, when they're done with me, they might want to come and chat with you because they're trying to collect stories on it and stuff like that." And she was just like, "Nah." She literally like,
no,
it was kind of like to some of the old timers up there. It was just part of being in that area. It was just part of living there. It was just part of the flora and fauna. And to some people, it's just not a big deal.
Yeah.
And I get that. I respected that. But I was a little surprised at first because it was kind of like, well, hey, you're a part of this story. You should be sharing it. But not all people feel that way necessarily, right? Mm-hmm. So here we are. We're still in 1979, and Regina Leader Post starts picking up the story, and they have an article called, Is There a Monster Living in Turtle Lake? 11 feet long, and there might be a more underwater, says Ben Blatz, a school teacher and co-owner of the Northlander Inn. And interestingly enough, this Blatz individual was starting to collect a lot of information on the monster back in the 80s. In fact, he was trying to interview people and put together a book on the topic. Now, the interesting thing is, I thought, well, hey, this is cool. Maybe somebody already wrote a book about this. I haven't been able to find it, and now, so I don't know if it's maybe just something that the family might have. I don't know. Maybe I just haven't dug deep enough yet, because I still consider this actively being researched. This isn't something I'm done. This is an ongoing thing, and I might find new stuff in 10 years that I didn't realize existed, right? Going through, we're still in 1979. That did seem to be a pretty big year for newspaper articles. There was actually a mention in this one article from September 7th, also Saskatoon Star Phoenix, of a variety of maybe other monsters, both the Manipogo of Lake Winnipegosis in Manitoba.
Winnipegosis?
Yeah, Winnipegosis, yeah. And I don't know if I can pronounce this properly, and the Powaswap at Saskatoon. So there was even some story of a monster in Saskatoon, which admittedly I haven't researched. I don't know the first thing about it, but I assume if this is in the river system that it could have come and gone too at some point, right? It's a river system, so what makes you think that they'd stick around, right? And then there's the monsters in Loon Lake and Turtle Lake, they mention, of course. So Loon Lake was another one, which again I haven't researched yet. But
that's the one that my uncle spearfished in.
Yeah, Maswa.
Yeah, the one where he was unnerved by the size of the things down there. That's an interesting coincidence, actually.
It's amazing how things kind of align, right? Yeah. It's a small world, right? As you say.
Oh, yeah. And I can sink my teeth more into something like this. People saying like, oh, the Loch Ness Monster is a
plesiosaur.
Yeah, long lost plesiosaur. It's like, okay, well, that's just a 60 million year gap we have to account for. That's it. But sturgeons are a species today, and they have been known to go into lakes.
And they get fucking big.
Yeah.
They're big, yeah.
Well, the other thing, the plesiosaur theory, which of course I've heard as well, the other big problem I have with it is the ice ages that seem to happen every 10 to 20,000 years. How would a plesiosaur have existed through our last ice age 10,000 years ago?
Yeah.
When I presume that Turtle Lake would have had 100 feet of ice on it or more.
Well, and like I'm not a geologist. I'm just a southern country demon here. But like if you look at a lot of the lakes in Saskatchewan, they're very much these long, skinny lakes that run north to south. Because what happened is glaciation, right? Like glaciers came over top of Saskatchewan, and when they receded, they dragged rocks and boulders and just huge chunks of ice and dug out all these crevasses, which is why most lakes, like I said, are north-south as opposed to east-west, or they're very, very round because they're kettle lakes.
Yeah.
So there probably wasn't a turtle lake 65 million years ago. First off, it was probably underwater in the Western Interior Seaway, but also these weren't really made until after the Ice Age anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and Turtle Lake definitely fits in what you just said. It's not that deep of a lake. Like I do have a depth map and I think the deepest that lake is approximately 45 to 50 feet deep at its deepest. That's the absolute deepest, and I think the average was 6 meters or something like that. Maybe you can find the fact for me there, but I think its average depth is about 6 meters, which would be about 18, 20 feet, that kind of thing.
And clear water, you said.
Yeah, clearish water. Yeah, I would say compared to some lakes I've been to, definitely clear. So we'll just carry on, and now we're going to get into 1981. Calgary Herald had an interesting article on page A8. It says here, every summer numerous tourists, residents, and fishermen tell of seeing this monster. And then it says indigenous of the area talk about big fish, which has been seen even as early as the turn of the century. That would be the last century, just for clarity there. And it says here, recently on October 23rd, residents of the southwest end of the lake had a first-hand look at the creature. Another little blurb in this article says there are over 70 lakes in the world which are said to have some kind of creature inhabiting them. So that's an interesting stat. Can we in Saskatchewan lay claim to a real live monster? I would say yes, we can. So in 1981, the Edmonton Journal picked up on it, and there was a gentleman writer named Nick Lees, and he said he says, I was skeptical about reports of a 10-meter-long slimy creature in the 43-kilometer by 8-kilometer lake. He says, but a fishing trip made me a believer. I think his stats are just a tad bit off. Yeah, and remember I was mentioning that diver story? Here it is. A diver looking for a body was attacked by a fish bigger than himself. He refused to go down again.
Holy shit.
So,
it's like fair.
Crazy.
Same.
Crazy.
Fuck yeah.
I'm going to jump now to 1984, so just a couple of years later. And this was an interesting encounter. Joe Jacobson has farmed along Turtle Lake since 1918 and has fished in the lake frequently, but this was the first sighting of the famed finny being. With him was Don Wiley of 1689 Casino Avenue in Saskatoon.
Montgomery.
Yeah, Montgomery. I lived there as well, so it was kind of cool. The pair were out in Jacobson's 4-meter aluminum, putting along on the Dead Calm Lake when they saw a series of waves rolling toward them. Neither had seen a boat around, and so they decided to investigate. All of a sudden, we saw this big thing in the water. It was coming straight towards the boat, but when it heard our little motor, it swung sideways and dove. We saw this big fin sticking up and part of the back. I figured it was at least 12 feet, 4 meters long. Jacobson, who was driving, turned the boat sideways about 50 meters away when they realized what they were looking at. A few seconds later, the creature dove for the deep. It was pretty black in color with big fin on top. It was long and heavy. He's a big one, Jacobson said. Wiley said they were not the only ones to see the monster this year. He said another man told him of seeing it about 10 days prior to their sighting. And Jacobson said he's convinced there is more than one of the monsters out there, perhaps as many as 3 or 4. And again, this came from Saskatoon Star Phoenix, July 11th, 1984. And the article was called Lake Monster Huge Sturgeon, ?
If that creek was ever high enough water for one of them to sneak in, I mean, for the same reason a couple more could have snuck in.
Then we go into 85, which happened to be the year that Dave and I saw we had our experience. And yeah, this is again sort of mention of at least 4 meter long sturgeon. Again, Saskatoon Star Phoenix. Scientists take to water to hunt the Loch Ness Monster. So I guess there were a lot of people trying to be scientific about this by that time, right?
Yeah.
And so they mention in this article, they talk a little bit about Turtle Lake. In this gentleman, Wayne Phillips, said, in the case of Turtle Lake, the monster has been reported to be a sturgeon. It's believed the sturgeon traveled up the Turtle River, yada, 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 and became trapped in the lake. I know 2 people who have seen very large, unusual creatures while fishing on the lake. The late Paul Gatsky saw what he thought was a floating log. Again, somebody else compared it to a log. And while on the way to Indian Point. There is actually a beach called Indian Point. I personally am still wondering if they're going to change that name one of these days because it's kind of politically incorrect. But it is still technically called Indian Point at this time. Just wanted to mention that. When he got close to it, the log suddenly submerged and swam away.
Just like what you guys saw.
Yeah.
And this is the one from the same year as you saw it?
No, this is 1987. So
okay,
this
but
was
only a couple years later.
Yep, just a couple years later. Yeah.
That swimming log just keeps coming up.
It keeps surfacing in the story.
Oh,
get out.
Good one.
But I'm betting that people who embellish or people who make up stories, like, I bet they lean into the fantastical elements. It wouldn't be like 13 feet long, it'd be 30 feet long. It wouldn't just look like a log and then submerge. It would do some dramatic stuff on top of the water.
Flash its
Like
fins.
there's that one Loch Ness one where it like clambered across the road and they chased it down and it like tried to bite at the woman and then it dove and huge splash. It's like, that's bullshit. But the people that are like, yeah, I thought I saw a log and it was a big fucking fish.
If they were trying to embellish it or make up a story, they'd almost be like underselling it. It seems like they're just saying what they saw, like about a 10 to like 13 foot long thing that appears like a big floating log or something until they get close and then it dives back under.
It's just messing with you, That's the whole point.
I wonder if sturgeons like basking in the sun. I know some fish, they go into like the upper layers of water to like soak up some of the heat from the sunlight during the day.
Yeah, and I haven't actually researched that, but that's a good point. Good question. So 1989, the Regina Leader Post posted an article that says everything you always wanted to know about Canada. In a cool fashion, the Turtle Lake Monster was mentioned, and I thought that was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And they mention a book, Mysterious Canada, which I happen to have in my hands here. Because I, again, try to collect anything that has to do with our Turtle Lake Monster.
Yeah.
This book was published in 1988 by John Robert Colombo, called Mysterious Canada. But again, this is one of my complaints, is that all of the books that I've been able to collect, these big books anyways, only have maybe a paragraph on the
It's like a little blurb.
Exactly. A little blurb. And this is the first and only instance where it's been referred to as the Turtle Lake Terror. The only time I've ever heard it referred to as the Turtle Lake Terror is in this book.
You just want to zhuzh it up, make it sexier.
Yeah, maybe, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, take that for what it's worth. And I can just read it. It's very short. It just says, the Turtle Lake Terror takes its name from Turtle Lake in southwestern Saskatchewan. In winter, it tears huge holes in the nets of local fishermen. In summer, it frightens swimmers and boaters. According to the Canadian Press story carried by the Niagara Falls Review, 31 of January 1979, the huge monster has 3 humps, a long neck, the head of a horse, pig, or dog, depending on the report of the observer. The Turtle Lake Terror has been dismissed as being a large sturgeon. There are reports of a monster appearing in the lake since the mid-1920s. And that's what they have. I mean, at least it's there.
It seems like they use the more sensational but lesser told version of the story, because I think you only mentioned once that one of the sightings was the 3-hump dog head thing, but most of the sightings seem to be this big log one.
Well, yeah, and I actually read somewhere that the 3-hump theory might actually just be like, it could have been fins, right? Could you be seeing some fins, right? So maybe from a distance it looked like 3 humps, but in fact it was like fins. Then we just kind of jump into the 1990s, and there isn't a ton. There, you could see it starts to decline, but there are some articles in the 90s, a couple. And interestingly enough, there was a Saskatchewan author named Jenny Mayer, who wrote a book, a fictional book, a children's book on she called The Mystery of the Turtle Lake Monster.
I read that book when I was a kid.
Did you?
Yeah. I was Googling, and I was like, I remember reading that. Like, I recognize the cover. I totally remember reading that Turtle Lake Monster book.
Even though it was based on some fiction, there was also, it's based loosely on a few facts. And I was just happy that it was published. I thought, at the time, back in the 90s, I thought, oh, good, this is going to get nationally recognized. Well, I don't know if that ever happened, or internationally recognized, but but it was nice to see that somehow the name and the legend would carry on, right? So in 1991, there was a cool article, Saskatoon Star Phoenix, published January 8th. What's in the lake? Monsters or sun-worshipping sturgeon? And that's, again, for someone who's interested, go checking out that article. In 1994, there was just a little blurb in the Star Phoenix that says 10 years ago, Joe Jacobson, who had farmed along Turtle Lake since 1918, and his companion Don Wiley sighted what they believed to be the Turtle Lake Monster. Native lore said a huge monster lurked in the lake. So that was just kind of a 10-year anniversary little article that they wrote. And June 12th, 1993, there was a Star Phoenix article. And so just one little blurb in this article that said, all that aside, the discovery of the pseudoryx raises an interesting question for other species. Perhaps tales about Saskatchewan's Turtle Lake Monster will be received in the future with less skepticism.
Yeah.
So, and that again was published June 12th, 1993. And then we get into 2005 was the next article, and which is pretty much the end of what I've been able to collect. And he just said, catching the biggest fish in the whole world, Wayne Phillips. The Turtle Lake Monster is likely a sturgeon that was trapped in the lake when it could no longer get down the river. Yeah. So July 24th, 2005, page 33. Those are just there are a few other articles that I was able to collect. Those were just some of the more interesting ones. And indeed, some of the articles were owned by like the Canadian Press, so they would be repeated in multiple newspapers.
Yeah.
So just because I mentioned one city doesn't mean that that's the only place that was published, because some of these articles were owned by Canadian Press, which was a national group. So that's kind of what I've been able to collect so far. Aside from the fact that I have a ball cap that I can't wear because it looks absolutely hideous on me. I can't wear it, but when we left and sold our cabin in 1987, I went into the Northlander Inn and bought this for a souvenir. I wanted to have a souvenir of the lake.
Oh, I love it.
So yeah, it's a cool hat. I just can't wear it. Like there's some people who can wear any hat. I'm not one of those people. I look absolutely hideous in this style of cap, but it's nonetheless something that I hang with pride in my home. And it's just a little piece of reality that says, hey, I didn't imagine the whole thing. Here it is. It's real. It's in my hands. This, it wasn't just me. The Northlander Inn took great pride in advertising that said the Northlander Inn, Turtle Beach Resort, on beautiful Turtle Lake, home of the Turtle Lake Monster. So it was well known in the area. So that's kind of what I have for material so far. But I'm always looking for more.
As you've described it, the timeline seems to fit pretty well. Like it started popping up in like the early 1900s, perhaps like a high water level let them in. And if they died off in the early 2000s, I mean, that's about the lifespan of a sturgeon. And it makes sense that the sightings would perk up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s because it would be at its biggest size then. It'd be near the end of its life.
Yeah.
It'd be fucking massive. Oh, and the biodiversity of the lake could keep something that size like fed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's such a plausible explanation but no proof for it.
Exactly. So we technically, to be scientifically accurate, we can't conclude that it's a sturgeon. It still has to be considered a cryptid until somebody pulls some piece of tangible evidence out of that lake.
And if they died, I don't know, like lakes decompose things very quickly and efficiently, so I don't even know if you could recover it if they're all dead now.
Right, and the cartilage, I think I'm assuming a lot of cartilage. I don't know how that persists in a lake once a creature dies. I don't know.
I don't know how many people would want to like scrape the lake bottom for sturgeon bones anyway.
Well, exactly. Yeah, totally. But I still find it fascinating that after 100 years, nobody's been able to pull. Like if there were a lot of sturgeon in there, even 2 or 3, it still blows my mind that we haven't been able to
pull nothing out of it.
Anything out of the lake.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I've heard people that have caught sturgeon like in the river down by Petrovka Bridge, and they say that every time they've ever caught one, because you can't catch them right, you have to release them right away because they're endangered here. Every time they've caught one, they thought they were snagged on a rock or a log or something. They always think it's a snag until they finally get it. It starts to move, and they go, okay, I'm going to have to get this big log out of there, and this big fuck-off fish shows up, and they got to get rid of it. So I wouldn't be surprised if people have totally caught a sturgeon in Turtle Lake and just went, fuck, the log snip.
Yep, absolutely. It's happened to me many times where I thought I was just caught on a log.
Yeah, and you just cut your losses, literally, and then
totally.
make a new line.
Cut your losses.
So every time I've caught a log or a rock or something that I thought was a log or a rock, I'm just going to assume that was actually a sturgeon now.
A big fuck-off
Which means
sturgeon.
there's a whole lot of them out there now.
Fun true real fact, there are actually no logs or rocks in lakes. Every one is a sturgeon.
Every one of them
in
is
every
a
lake
sturgeon.
in the world.
Yeah, we can confirm
That's
that.
the soundboard demon guarantee.
I'm a demon. You can trust me. Sign on the line.
So in an effort to keep the legend alive, we live in an interesting age now with IT and the internet, and there's benefits and downfalls, because the benefit is that we can make information so easily and readily available to anybody that's interested. I guess the downfall is that audiences are extremely fragmented. So whatever medium you choose, you're going to get just a certain portion of the audience, right? So I find it the really interesting time that way. Like it used to be, if you got an article published in the newspaper, that was like huge because everybody would see it because everybody got the newspaper. Nowadays, how many people actually get physical copies of the paper and stuff like that?
Not
right?
me.
Right. Well, so interestingly enough, I've written a couple of articles just recently trying to celebrate the 100th plus anniversary of the Turtle Lake Monster. And I had an article printed recently in the North Battleford Regional News Optimist, partly because they're not that far from Turtle Lake. So, of course, they have a vested interest in publishing it. So I wrote a letter to the editor, and that was published on January the 5th. And then I published another one that was similar, not exact, but similar, gave that to the Star Phoenix and the Leader Post. And they both published that one on the 13th, Friday the 13th, interestingly enough.
Awesome.
So those are both available for anybody that wants to access newspaper archives. And I've also started a Facebook group, just a chat group. It's not a commercial site in any way. It's just for people that are interested in the topic. And so it's facebook.com. And it's just Stories of the Turtle Lake Monster. If you just search for Stories Turtle Lake Monster, the site will come up.
Link will be in the show notes.
Yeah, I had actually found, as we were talking, because part of what I do is just search for stuff so I can chime in.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, hey, someone's got this Stories of Turtle Lake Monster, and I'm like, oh,
it's Rob.
It's Rob. I was like, oh, hey, here's a cool one from the Starfading. It was Rob.
So is all this stuff like you just posted on that Facebook page, or is there another place where you're keeping it? Or
Well,
is there like
I
a PDF?
I am trying to write an anthology, which currently is up to about 43 pages in length. But because I'm basically taking snapshots of newspaper articles, I don't know that it's something I can commercially sell. I don't know, like, I haven't researched enough the fair use policy, international fair use, to know whether I can actually, like, publicize this and turn it into, like, a commercial book. I also don't know if I can get quite enough material for that. So stay tuned. But at the moment, I have basically a 43-page guide that I'm happy to make available to anybody who would like to read it free of charge, because I don't want to get nailed for copyright. It's just an interesting question. Like, what do newspaper companies do with 40 to 50-year-old newspaper articles? I sent an email to the Canadian Press saying, hey, there's these articles on the Turtle Lake Monster, and I'm just wondering if I could get your permission to use them. And I heard nothing. So I don't know. Does this make me a bad communicator? Like, both emails I sent inquiring about things recently, nothing back. So, I just wondered, like, am I just a bad communicator? Like, I don't know. Like,
gotta keep trying.
Yeah, or like, do you just interpret that to mean your small fish don't bother us? Like, I don't know what that means. I have no idea when you don't get a response.
Right.
Maybe the big fish don't bother them.
Yeah, and just again, the fish. You got to call this the pun episode, I think, because
it's real punny.
Very. Oh, another one. Ha ha.
The attention economy is stressed right now. There's more things competing for people's attention than ever before. Our podcast gets more downloads than 95% of other podcasts, but we're still like small fish in a big pond. That means we get a few thousand downloads per episode, but like we're still small fish in a big pond because we're competing with that empire of attention and all that.
Well,
so it's hard to get stuff out.
Well, you remember that time, though. I don't think we're quite small. I mean, there was that time the soundboard demon was on Joe Rogan,
The Joe Rogan Experience.
My God, your head is so much shinier in person.
Look, when we were monkeys hiding from eagles, you had to fuck as much as you could and spread that seed around because you likely only had 5 or 6 years on this earth. That's still inside of us. You go, oh, this is nature and it's dirty little trick. Dirty little trick trying to get me to spread my seed.
Joe, what the actual fuck are you saying? That happens from time to time, but I have to disguise myself as someone else. I don't want people photobombing or, doxing me and Joe Rogan, small fish, or whatever.
He actually played the part of a pseudo-archaeologist to try and ruin the world of archaeology.
Hey, don't out me as Graham Hancock. Okay. Gotta keep that one under wraps.
Okay.
Just got my Netflix special out. I mean, his Netflix special out.
Oh, jeez. We gotta erase this. Delete the VOD. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, what I've been doing with this 43 plus, and it's still growing. That's the thing with what I'm trying to accumulate here. I'm not done. And I don't know if you're ever done, right? That's the big thing. So I've been submitting it to a few local archives, because archives are a way to take a message that you want to relay to the future and just make sure that it's stored somewhere.
It's like a time capsule.
Yeah, it is. I'm not going to this isn't about making money. This is just about taking a story that's important to Saskatchewan's history, to our history, to Canadian history, and making sure that it doesn't get forgotten. Because really, the sense I'd gotten over the last 20, 30 years was that this story was just kind of
fading away. Yeah.
And I didn't know if maybe that's because I wasn't at the lake at that particular lake anymore or not. But I think based on the research I've done, you could just sort of see how the articles have kind of faded off. And when I went up to Turtle Lake, I happened to meet the people that now own our cabin that we had up there. And, they had heard this, they had heard of the legend, but they hadn't heard a lot. And, it was kind of like, even up there, I wonder if the story was starting to fade. And that's what concerned me. And I thought, you know what? Somebody's got to pool all this information, start pulling it together into one spot. And maybe that's me. Maybe that's, I don't see anybody else doing it. So maybe that's my little contribution to the world for the future, right?
I love that.
My little teeny tiny contribution.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can imagine some inquisitive kid in the year like 21, 23 going like, oh, wait, there was rumors of a monster in this lake? Where can I find more about that? And then, this Robert guy from 100 years ago put it all in this record.
Yeah, totally. Well, it also makes really fun campfire chatter, right? What's more fun than sitting around a campfire talking about legends? Like, if we had it all figured out, the world would be a much less interesting place, right? I think the world needs some mysteries, right?
Yeah, I love a little mystery. Makes the world more interesting.
So I've also, coming up here, I'm just going to BC here in February, and I'm going to meet with author John Kirk, who actually wrote one of these books that I had just mentioned. He's actually the head of the British Columbia Cryptozoological Society, I think.
Awesome.
And so that's what they do, is they pool information on cryptids, on creatures that have not necessarily been assigned a spot in our biological hierarchy, right? In our biology textbooks. And they try to keep an open mind, and they also try to debunk a lot of things, which is really cool. Anyway, if you can look them up on Google too if you're interested in such things.
It's the BCSCC, the British Columbia Scientific Cryptozoology Club.
Thank you, because I can never keep that straight. Thank you very much.
Bit of a wordy one.
Yeah.
Bit of a wordy one. Hey, they got Champy. They've got Manipogo.
And it's nowhere near unprecedented. Like, before gorillas were discovered, people would come down and said, hey, there's big hairy men up in those mountains. And people were like, fuck off. There is not. And then, sure enough, there was gorillas in those mountains. I think what you're doing is important. This mystery's an interesting one. The Amazon river dolphin, as bombastic and entertaining as it is, I don't really think there's a devil dolphin seducing Brazilian women. That's a bit far-fetched. But like a giant sturgeon that got caught in a lake, and it spends some of its free time just freaking out fishermen. Like, totally. I can buy into that.
And kids.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about the Turtle Lake Monster, and we got the story from Rob, but we're not going to let him talk about it anymore because he's given us an hour and a half of it. What was your experience with the Turtle Lake Monster?
Well, you see, that's a long story because the Turtle Lake Monster was omnipresent in everything. Every time you looked out at the lake, you felt the omnipresent Turtle Lake Monster, whether you'd seen it or not. It was always there. Right. So,
the lake does have a special aura, doesn't it, Dave? The lake has a very special aura and feel to it. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It's murky. The water is very, very murky and really cold. And so when you hear stories about monsters, it's highly plausible. So especially if you're a kid, right? And you're like, wow, there's something larger than life out there. Yeah, it's everywhere. Not even before you see it.
Update, Dave is high.
No. No. Just coffee.
Just coffee.
So, your brother mentioned that you saw a dorsal fin when he didn't. Like I kind of want to see it from your eyes. Like, what did you observe as you were approaching? And did you think it was a log at first as well?
Yeah, it looked like a log. Well, it looked like a something. We just thought it was a log. We're like, well, it was long and dark and sitting in the middle of the lake. What else could it be? It'd be a log, right?
And it was so motionless, you guys were like worried that a boat might hit it and stuff, eh?
Yeah, and we were also curious. And said, well, that's cool. Let's go check it out. And have a little project and tow it away. And until we got closer to it and then realized that's not a log. I don't remember exactly how far away we were. To me, it seems like it was like right next to the canoe, but that might be my childhood imagination. We were really close. I remember looking down on it. So not across, right? Not from a distance, but actually down on it. And seeing this ridge, scaly, dark back with all these little ridges all over the place. And then like, stunned silly for a second, and it moved. And I did see the dorsal fin. It looked like a shark fin.
How old were you when this happened?
8, 9, 10.
It was not like you were 4 years old and
no, I was not. No. Yeah, I was 8, 9, 10, and then we freaked out, obviously, and we shouldn't have. It's too bad we didn't have cell phones or cameras, and take video like you can do now. But so obviously we freaked out because all of a sudden this thing that looked, at least in my childhood eyes, like it was larger than a canoe. It may have been, it may not have been, but it was at least 6 feet long, at least.
Were you aware of the Turtle Lake Monster before this experience? Or?
Well, yeah, that was the aura of the lake. We always knew the stories. Like I said, it was always there, in our minds, without ever actually seeing it. So it had this omnipresent feeling about it. But we had no idea what it was or what it would look like. It could have been anything, until we saw this. And it's my fishtail, right? It's cool.
So a lot of folks kind of think it might have been a big old sturgeon. What are your thoughts on possible ID as a sturgeon or one of these late surviving plesiosaur dinosaurs
No. Not a dinosaur. No. Yeah, I mean, in hindsight, when you start researching sturgeon, what they actually look like, and actually here in BC, on the Fraser River, there are some very large sturgeon in that river, and if you see videos of them, it's exactly what we saw, and they can grow up to like 10 feet. When I was 9 or 10, I had no idea what a sturgeon was.
It was just the turtle-like monster.
Yeah.
It was a turtle-like monster. Absolutely. It was bigger than our canoe, man. I mean, nothing's bigger than our canoe. So I would say, in hindsight, that's exactly what it was. At the time, it was sure. It was a plesiosaurus, if you like.
Yeah, we also have to give you credit, Dave, because according to my diary, you were the first person to spot it, Dave.
That's my monster. I missed that thing. As far as I know, there haven't been any sightings of it for 15 years or so, or any like real stories. So, I kind of miss my monster.
I know we have a friend of our podcast who did see it sometime around the year 2000, maybe 2002, but even then, that's still,
right.
20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I mean, and since then, I don't think there have been any real sightings,
Well, yeah, it stayed with us our entire lives. Here we are in our 40s.
It stayed with us our entire lives, and it's not like, I don't know, there are lots of big animals, big mammals, big fish, and you can usually spot them. They're usually more predictable, right? I mean, you'd be awe-inspired to see a whale, but you'd also see, well, that's a whale, right? And say, well, this is really cool. I'm looking at a whale, and it quantifies that. And say, now I can tell a story at the time I saw a whale. But this, we didn't know what it was. That's kind of my piece. But yeah, I'm really happy. I missed the monster terribly, and I'm glad I got to meet it once.
How do you feel about your brother becoming the turtle-like monster guy and passing on your guys' stories?
I think that if someone to do it, he's the guy to do it.
Hell yeah. No,
thanks, Dave.
He seems dedicated and passionate and responsible about it. Yeah.
Absolutely. He's done a fantastic job, and super proud of him.
Oh, thanks, Dave.
So,
awesome.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us on recording here, and super glad we got to give you a call.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm glad to talk to you guys.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
You bet. Have a good day.
You
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having me on today, because really telling the tale and sharing the tale is the most important thing, and making sure that the tale never gets lost to history, because things can very easily get lost to history, right? That's, I think, part of where my drive comes from, is, just making sure that this carries on into the future. So thank you for having me on.
Of course.
The last thing I'll ask you, if there's somebody out there who saw something at Turtle Lake, wants to get in contact with you and pass their story on, how should they get a hold of you?
Yeah, the stories of the Turtle Lake Monster, my Facebook page is probably the best. You can reach me on there, and we can chat privately too. You don't have to put things up there publicly. So if you just want to get in touch and say, hey, I have a story, or my aunt had a story, I'm not. It doesn't necessarily have to be firsthand. And I mean, now we're talking a century plus into this legend, so they may be secondhand stories, third-hand stories. That's cool. You'll notice that my Facebook page says stories of the Turtle Lake Monster, because it's not about trying to figure out what it is. Is it a sturgeon? What's the exact biological definition of this creature? It's about collecting the pooled experiences that people have had. So I'm not going to challenge you in every way to prove your story. It's because it's about the stories. It's not about
Yeah, it's about culture and community and preserving that legend.
And experiences, yeah. You know, and I mean, if somebody gets on there and decides, yeah, I'm just going to screw with Rob and I'm going to give him this outlandish story, well, okay.
Yeah.
Our listeners wouldn't do that.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it would be up there and, you know, take it for what it is. This is what this person said, you know.
Last weekend I was at Turtle Lake. There was a thing popped out, had 20 heads.
Yeah, exactly.
They're singing the marimba in chorus.
So, you know, you have to take stories for what they're worth. And if people want to throw like crazy shit up there, well, so be it. But it is going to look like crazy shit, right?
Yeah.
So.
Speaking of stories, for listeners, if you go back to episode 191, our Lake Monsters episode for Halloween, we do have our semi-regular contributor, Murgy, did have a short story about the Turtle Lake Monster and his experience with it as a youth. So go give that a listen. It's right at the end of the episode.
Cool.
Yeah, I implore you to pass on a story if you have one. Just go right to that Facebook group and contact Rob. For Occultae Veritatis, I've been Ood Gallifrey, and in studio with me I have...
Sage Berry,
Richard Bigley,
Leon Felger,
the Soundboard Demon, son of a bitch,
and our very special guest presenter,
Rob Grosse.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Love you, bye.
Good night.
When Murgy originally recorded his Turtle Lake story on the Lake Monsters episode 191, I didn't know that we would be meeting Rob and hearing all about the Turtle Lake Monster. And it's even more appropriate, I think, to hear this story again after hearing Rob go through the whole story. So here's an average Saskatchewan kid that experienced the Turtle Lake Monster in his childhood. So to play us out as both the after show and the palate cleanser, here is Murgy doing his retelling of spotting the Turtle Lake Monster. See you next time.
So I'm going to present the Turtle Lake Monster in a bit of a short story, because that's kind of how I encountered it. So the Highway number 3, heading west out of Glasgow, hasn't changed much since the gray days of late summers in the early 2000s. It's along this familiar route that an old tourist station wagon rumbled many times, before hooking a right past Livelong to the shores of Turtle Lake, having followed a dusty old secondary road to the resort community of Kivamaw Moonlight Bay. Along the slow, narrow road through town, past the silhouette of the beach playground against the cloudy sky with iron seesaws begging to claim another tailbone. Around the bend and into the long gravel driveway, the tired old wagon rolled. The trip from Saskatoon could be long and ended with a hard swerve to avoid a much-accursed birch stump that was always somehow forgotten when the tow chains were about, and the occupants of the tired old vehicle always spilled into the crisp Saskatchewan air with a sense of relief that was hardly dulled by the paling light of this particular evening. Up they went into the mobile home trailer they called their weekend home, hauling coolers and bags and shedding the worries of their mundane lives with every creak of the old wooden stairs. The growing winds stirred the ancient pines that hemmed in these hallowed, if somewhat shabby halls, but did little to disturb the peace of the blanket of browning needles sewn beneath them. Scarce could these trees be still again before the steel screen door of the mobile home erupted with an echoing bang. It issued a scrawny young boy, no more than 10 and all buck teeth and protruding ears, armed with an ancient fishing pole and hand-me-down tackle. Behind him, a tired father, similarly armed but somewhat less in the spirit, followed his son's crunching footsteps down the drive. He had very little to worry about, for his son knew well the route and could follow it dead blind in the darkest night. Around the bend, past the whispering pines, weaving through the seesaws and the merry-go-round, the little boy ran, straight down the beach to the public boat launch and the steely gray-green waters beyond. This was the only place on Earth the little boy at this time had ever been taught to fish. He'd cast and retrieve, sometimes losing a bent old red and white lure to the weeds out left in hopes of luring out a particularly stupid or bored young pike. And all the hours spent would go by in the blink of an eye, pockmarked by excitement every time there was a hit on the line, or a sufficiently convincing snagging of the weeds. And it was the same on this gray summer day, the little boy doing his best not to further aggravate his sighing father, casting and retrieving. Cast and retrieve. There's a glimpse of sudden movement and a shadow beneath the darkening waves, catching the boy's eyes, and his heart all but stands still. There was a shape, a gray shape, lighter enough than the surrounding pallor to stand out starkly in the water, as big as the steel pontoon boat the boy had spied in awe on the water 2 weeks prior, moving quickly through the waves. The boy froze, any fear of his lure sinking and snagging forgotten, as he watched the gray shape sink sibilantly below the water and disappear from sight. Frozen still, he stood with his heart hammering in his ears. The boy knew well enough that fishing time was a period of sacred silence, and he dared not further tease his father's already fraying nerves. Suddenly, the boy remembered his hands and hastily spun the reel handle to retrieve his now distant lure. It wasn't until much later, during a secret confession to his sisters that fell within earshot of his mother, that she told the boy that he might have seen the Turtle Lake monster. She told him it was a mysterious creature who lived in the depths of the little green lake. Upon their return to the city, she even showed her son the book about the creature and the news clippings about its near sightings in the 70s and 80s, claiming that the legend of the creature reached back to the myths of the local Cree people. The Turtle Lake monster, with its gray body and seahorse-like head, is a common myth, she said, and many fishermen along the lake had seen it peek up near their boats and disappear in a flash throughout the decades. The prevailing theory was, and still is, that the monster is a giant sturgeon that made its way up to the lake during a flood of the nearby river system and took up residence in its deeps. More fanciful stories were that it was an ancient plesiosaur, a lonely survivor from the prehistoric times when all of Saskatchewan was a shallow sea. Whatever the creature's origin, the little boy's mind was set. He had seen the monster, and no one could convince him otherwise. Years later, that boy would wish he'd known at the time about the mundane distractions that would cause his family to leave Turtle Lake and its monster behind them. He'd have relished every subsequent cast from that dock that much more, even if they were made with a wary eye trained on the deeper waters. But when we're children, these things are out of our control, and the beauty of our youth is in the fleeting, forgetful innocence with which we experience these things and then forget. There are, however, always those things that sink their talons into our hearts to remain throughout the years. I didn't return to Turtle Lake until I was a young man, a greenhorn road management intern charged with supervising the application of dust control projects for the resort towns and reserve around the lake shores. I relished the opportunity to visit my childhood haunt and snuck away from our distributor rig to follow the familiar path one last time. When I got there, the old road into Moonlight Bay welcomed me like an old friend, so I followed. Around the bend, past the whispering pines, gazing past where the seesaws and merry-go-round used to be, I looked down the beach to the steely gray-green waters beyond. Despite the sun overhead, a cold chill ran down my spine, and I knew, deep down, I knew. I still believe in the Turtle Lake monster.